Hello, welcome to Digital Poetry and happy National Poetry Month. I'm Kate Meyer, one of 5 MLTI ambassadors working with the Maine Department of Education. My job as an ambassador is to provide instructional coaching and professional learning around digital citizenship, technology integration, and digital instructional design to teachers in the state of Maine. My role as an MLTI ambassador is a 2-year position. There are 5 of us, and we were all in the field last year as educators. Prior to my work as an MLTI ambassador, I spent 21 years as an English teacher and a design thinking teacher, mainly at Mount Desert Island High School in Bar Harbor. And when my 2-year appointment as an MLTI ambassador is finished, I will be returning back to my classroom. I'm so excited that you're here today to explore 3 ways to engage your students in play with digital poetry. So what are those strategies that we're going to talk about today? First, we're going to look at blackout poetry. We'll move on to collage poetry, and we will finish with the strategy of tile poetry. And then I have a lot of resources for you so that you and your students can get started with these activities quickly and easily. So we're going to jump into blackout poetry first. And before we get started, I just want to highlight this quote on this page by Rita Dove, who says, "Poetry is language at its most distilled and most powerful." And I love this quote. It guides me in the way that I think about and teach poetry to my students, because if you teach poetry to your students, you know that sometimes there can be some fear around poetry. So sometimes even just saying the word poetry can elicit a negative response in your students because they think that they have to fear it for some reason, that it's something that needs to be unlocked for them. And it's definitely not. So I'm always pointing out to my students that we're really just looking at language at its most distilled and most powerful. And so let's keep that in mind as we move through today, because these 3 strategies are great ways to get your students playing with poetry. So what is blackout poetry? Well, blackout poetry is a type of found poetry. That's when we find a poem in something that's already created, where you take a written piece of text from a book, newspaper, or magazine. And that's what you're seeing here on the screen, is a piece of text taken right from an article about NASA and this particular astronaut. And then you redact words from it in order to leave specific words and phrases behind that create a poem. The original idea behind blackout poetry was using black markers or paint to redact words, but technology allows us to take it to the next level. And trust me, as someone who used to do this with black paint, what was I thinking? Doing this digitally is just so much cleaner for the students, and creates really beautiful products too. So what you're seeing here are 2 different blackout poems, both done from nonfiction, science-based texts. I blacked out all the words I didn't want, keeping only the words and phrases that I needed. And I then layered images behind them to help enhance the meaning or the mood of the poem. Students can be tasked with creating a poem that highlights the main idea of the passage, or maybe the tone of the passage, or the mood of the passage, or even connections to other texts that you are studying. So how might you introduce this to your students? Well, first you will need to decide on what text you will be using. Will it be a passage from a science, history, or math textbook? Will it be a blog post or a news article? Will it be a page out of the novel that your students are reading? Any text can serve as a backdrop for digital poetry. Then you'll decide what content skill you're working with. Maybe you and your students are working on theme or mood or main ideas or connections with other texts that you're studying. Students can then scan the passage that you've given them or that they've selected, looking for words that catch their eyes and that draw attention to their focus, that content area focus that you've determined. They don't have to read the source document in full. They can start at the end, they can jump around, they can skip parts, wherever their creative mind takes them. I am including video tutorials in the resource section that will guide you and your students on the technology piece, specifically on using Google Slides for these activities. But essentially, the students are going to change their background to a light color and then use the highlighter tool in Slides to highlight the words and phrases that they want to keep in white, and then they'll change the background to black, which leaves behind only those highlighted words and phrases. Now, next part is where students get to dig in and play with images that they select that will help them enhance their poem. And I'll talk more about these skills on the next slide. Even though this is not necessarily a collaborative activity, I have always found that when I give students time in class to create and play, and I encourage them to help each other with the technical aspects, it very quickly turns collaborative as they explore the tech tools and then show each other what and how they are creating. And of course, these poems beg for an audience. So how will you share your students' work? Done on Google Slides, they're really easy to share. So do you keep them electronic or do you print them and maybe do a gallery walk? Blackout Poetry creates a space to teach both content area skills and also transferable text skills that our students can use later to create engaging visual slide decks for presentations and other projects. So in terms of content skills, we have main idea, mood, tone, connections to other text. Really, there are unlimited directions you can take this in your content area. Creating Blackout Poetry will engage students in tech skills as well. So students will work on changing their background color, highlighting the text, search for images. It's a great time to teach students how to search for and use images that are free for their use with modification, how to search for PNGs, how to remove backgrounds if needed, how to insert images, and then once they have those images inserted, how to format them so they can play with the transparency, flipping, resizing, cropping, and recoloring images. So all of those tech skills in this very simple and really easy way to engage in digital poetry play. All right, let's jump into some collage poetry. So collage poetry is a combination of images and poetry. Google Slides is, again, a perfect tool to create the collages. It includes the same transferable skills as Blackout Poetry to further develop students' overall presentation skills. There are different ways to approach collage poetry, of course. The example here is capturing the mood of the poem, The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, which I have always found to be very whimsical and a little bit dark. And then it combines two lines from that poem to create that mood. So you might say to your students, we're studying this poem. I would like you to determine what the tone of the poem is, create a collage that represents that tone, and then include two lines from the poem itself in your collage that you think contribute to the tone of the poem. Of course, as you can probably see, the text that you use doesn't have to be poetry. It can be quotes from whatever your students are studying in any content area. This example is an example of a poem that was created from multiple poems and then turned into one and then superimposed over a digital collage. So maybe you have a collection of poetry or, again, other texts that you want your students to explore. As they read through the collection, you can have them search for 6 to 8 striking lines or images within the poetry. They can write down those lines and cite the poems where the lines were found. The goal is that they then combine these lines together with their own linking words to create a new poem, and then also create that related visual collage of their own creation or curation. Can also be a whole poem put on top of that collage. So here I have this short poem by Robert Frost that says, "But outer space, at least this far, for all the fuss of the populace, stays more popular than populous." And I think that this collage is a great idea of taking the mood of that poem of being alone in space and making that visual. So, how might we introduce collage poetry to our students? Well, first you will decide on what you want the students to collect and how you want them to collect it. So, what type of digital collage will they be creating? Definitely show them examples to get them inspired. Feel free to use the examples in this presentation or even create your own, which is a really great way for you to get comfortable with using the technology to create collages. You can even Google search to see what other teachers are sharing online for digital collage poetry, and there's a lot out there to check out. Then show the students the tech skills that you're comfortable showing them and have a curated list of tutorials that they can access for other skills. Again, YouTube will be your friend here. I like to search for digital collage using Google Slides, or I might search for digital collage using Google Drawings or whatever platform you want to use. Again, give the students time to play and create. And maybe this is a good time to offer them a challenge. So I like to ask for at least 3 layers in a digital collage. I like there to be a foreground, a middle ground, and a background. But maybe the challenge is that your students have 3 layers and at least 1 pattern. I find that challenges really gamify the process and encourage students to take risks with their own skills. What I love about using Google Slides and Drawings for digital poetry collage is that there's really no way to mess this up. So students don't have to be worried about making a mistake. They can undo any action that they take on their slides. And if they really need to, they can go back and revision history to undo those bigger changes. So when I'm creating something and I get to a point where I really like it, but I want to keep playing with it, I just make a copy of the slide and then I continue to play on my copy. So I can make all the wild changes that I want. And if I don't like them, I just return to that original slide. It's really no big deal. So again, this process really engages the idea of play. And these slides are so visual that they need to be shared in a way that everyone can appreciate them fully. So again, think about what you have available to your at your school as a way to share student work. And again, this activity teaches content skills, the main idea, the mood, tone, connections to other text like Blackout Poetry, but they can take their digital collage poetry further. Students can create their piece and then you can ask them to explain that creation, where they maybe have to cite specific words, lines, or phrases from throughout the text that support their choices, which can be done in writing. It can be done using a video platform like Flipgrid, or it can even be a presentation to a small group or the class. And it doesn't have to be poetry. It can be quotes and concepts that you're studying. Students can create collages to demonstrate almost anything in every content area. And again, you've got those same transferable tech skills with some additional more advanced creation skills. So students are working on changing the background, searching for images that are available for use with modification, searching for PNGs or removing those backgrounds if needed, inserting images, finding and using patterns to create texture, working in those layers using the arrange tool. So again, challenging students to have different layers, that foreground, middle ground, and background, the transparency of images, flipping, resizing, cropping, and recoloring, and what happens when you reflect images. So the digital collage poetry is a great place for students to really dig into all those digital tools that Google Slides or Google Drawings offers as a way to play with images. And finally, I have tile poetry for you. Digital tile poetry is inspired, of course, by magnetic poetry. Again, I've created these little tiles right in Google Slides. So I just made a Google slide. I changed the background to black, and then I created text boxes that had white fill. And I popped my words into those text boxes. I like to leave a row of blank tiles so that students can add their own words as they need them. And what you're looking at here, of course, are science terms related to space, but these could easily be social studies, English, or math concepts. Tile poetry is the perfect way to get students exploring content area vocabulary. Done digitally, I can easily create backgrounds for my students to use for their poems, or they can create a background and then add the tiles. So this background took me just a few minutes to create. It's two images layered on top of each other. So I simply changed the background to this night sky image and then searched for and found and very quickly added this image of an astronaut floating in space. And then I just used a drag and drop to grab those tiles from the tile bank and put them onto this slide in a poem. So how might you introduce tile poetry to your students? Well, the options and combinations for this are endless. So you need to think about how might you leverage this activity to engage students in your content area vocabulary, and also what content area vocabulary or concepts can you use to create the tiles? And then think about who's creating this set of tiles. So does the teacher create the background? Does the student? Does the teacher create the tiles? Does a student co-author tiles with you? And again, giving students time to play and create right in class will generate excitement around this content area vocabulary that you are working with. Again, it's a bold visual piece. So how might you share this with a larger audience? I find that tile poetry works beautifully as social media shares if your school has a social media presence. My school has screens all around the building that flip through slides all day long, and I just think that these would be a great addition in between all those announcement slides. They would also make great screensavers for the large screen in your classroom. Again, there are so many possibilities for sharing these beautiful visual creations. What I love about digital poetry and digital collage is that they offer learning opportunities that are steeped in play. The concept of found poetry can take away that intimidation factor that sometimes comes, again, like I said, with even saying the word poetry to your students. In fact, if you want, you can simply call them digital collages if your students have very adverse reactions to the word poetry. And then when they're done, it's a great time to talk about the poetry in each piece that they created without even knowing it, as they selected words, phrases, and lines that distilled language down to its most powerful. I have put together resources for you and also resources that are great to share with your students so they can get right into those tech skills. Don't be intimidated by the tech skills piece if you've never used Google Slides to create digital collage. I've created these resources for you so that you will be able to dive right in. So here's what we have for Blackout Poetry. I have a link for you that will show you how to teach Blackout Poetry, and then Book Riot has some beautiful examples of Blackout Poetry that you might share with your students in order to inspire them. This final link here in this column for Blackout Poetry is to an article from NCTE that will give you some ideas for taking your Blackout Poetry lessons to the next level. And then finally is a video that for you and also for your students. It's a quick and easy way to create Blackout Poetry in Google Slides. Again, YouTube will be your best friend for tutorial resources. Simply search for Blackout Poetry and your favorite creation tool. For collage poetry, I have included a link to Poetry Meets Art, which will help you design the perfect learning experience for your students. And then links to 3 sites that I use for all of my digital art: Pixabay and Unsplash, which give you free images that are available for commercial use with modification. And that's really important that we start teaching students digital citizenship around where we find images and how we use them. And also a link to Remove Background, which is an incredibly easy way to remove backgrounds from images. The video link below in this column is a link to a tutorial on using Google Slides for collages. And again, it's for you and also for your students. And for tile poetry, I have a link to resources on how to create tile poetry in slides and drawings, which essentially functions the same in the same way when it comes to creating a collage. And then the video tutorial is from one of my favorite educational YouTubers, Pocketful of Primary. Her video is on creating drag and drop activities in Google Slides, which is essentially what tile poetry is. And it's really more of a tutorial for you rather than for your students. And unless you have decided that you are going to have your students create all of the tiles and the collage themselves. And if you're doing that, this tutorial might be helpful for them as well. Thank you so much for joining me today. If you have any questions about digital poetry and collage, please do reach out to me via email and don't hesitate to ask. I'll be including a link to the slide deck in the description of this video, along with the link to the feedback form. When you complete the feedback form, you'll automatically be given to a link to a PD certificate with your PD half hour right in there. And don't forget to check out and subscribe to the MLTI YouTube channel for all the latest MLTI PD videos by all of the ambassadors. Again, thank you so much for joining me today. See you next week.